It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Daniela Urbina. Daniela is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. She received her BA from the Universidad Católica in Chile and her PhD in sociology and social policy from Princeton University. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University. Daniela is among the most insightful and dedicated researchers investigating topics on family, women's autonomy, and marriage in Latin America. Her work has been published in Demography, Journal of Marriage and the Family, Population Development Review, and in many other prestigious journals. Recently, she published an article in PDR documenting a very interesting pattern of family life in Latin America, contrary to increasing homogamy in marriages that go together with increases in female education. She finds, despite these improvements in education, a very strong pattern of hypergamy in marriages in Latin America, which contradicts what we see in other regions. And it helps us put in context the meaning of women autonomy, and so fascinating findings. She's extending this research, investigating cultural beliefs about family and gender and how they affect assortative mating. And we're very happy that she's going to share her work with us today. Okay, so please help me welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I see so many familiar faces. It's just really exciting to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about female advantages in education and information, particularly by looking at the case of Colombia. So in the last decades, Latin American women have achieved major gains in employment, political representation, and reproductive freedoms. But one of the most dramatic changes has been in women's schooling. So this graph here plots over time changes in gender gaps. So the countries above the dotted line are countries where men have more education than women. So as you can see, there's an evident decline of gender gaps favoring men. And in the youngest birth cohort, we're going to start to see a female advantage in education. So as you can see here, countries like Chile, Paraguay, Honduras in the 1970s have already female advantages. And then countries like Mexico, Colombia, Argentina also have female advantages starting right in the 1970s onwards. So in many countries, we see an overturn of the gender gap in education. And as you can imagine, of course, this are massive changes in terms of certification with potential consequences for labor markets, family formation, inequality, and so forth. And there's been a lot of work by sociologists and demographers about the implications of this sort of trend in high-income contexts. But I'm arguing here that we know much less about what are the implications of these reversals in middle and low-income countries that have very different contextual features. And in particular, I want to argue today that the Latin American context is a very interesting case to study the implications of this reversal, partly because they have happened where there's a lot of prevalence of patriarchal cultural norms. In most of these countries, this is a generalization, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But in general, there's a high presence of what's called machismo culture. I don't know if the same term applies in Portuguese, but this basically is depicting gender views about housework, resistance of wives to work outside the home, and the pressure of marrying up in terms of education and other markers of status, right? And that marrying up is also called the hypergamy norm, right? So this is the cultural context where all these changes are taking place. And of course, I think this then yields, in many ways, a tension between this set of beliefs of gender and family, and then there's like quite rapid shifts in education and women's education. And so that tension is what really motivates me in my current, this line of my work, try to explore how that tension yields has different implications in terms of information and also a lot of couple dynamics. Okay, so today I'm going to be answering one broad question. So under this contextual conditions I just described, does increasing women's education relative to men shift information patterns? So as we see these cohorts are gaining education, do we see shifts in information? And to answer this question, I'm gonna focus on one country, Colombia. I'll say more about why I'm focusing on Colombia. But before that, I also just wanted to mention, I'm going to focus on two dimensions of uniformation in this work. So I'll start with how does changes in women's schooling at the population level shift whether and when women marry, so that's like union entry, if you will. And then after that, we're going to look at who do they marry, so assortative mating or marital pattern. So like two dimensions of the uniformation process. And before I proceed, I want to be clear that the analysis is going to include both cohabitating and married couples, heterosexual couples. In the Colombian context and in most Latin American countries, these unions have coexisted, so marriage and cohabitation. In the case of Colombia, they represent around 2/5 of all unions. And in the Colombian context, at least in the cohorts I study, there's not an association between cohabitation and education. That might be changing, but it's not something present in the cohorts I'm studying. So I want to present a short roadmap for my talk. I'll talk more about my motivation for this research question. I'll go through my theoretical expectation or hypotheses, present my empirical case, Colombia, and then we're going to just delve into my results regarding entry to marriage and the data methods. And after that, we're going to go into who marries whom, assortative mating, data methods, and results. I'm doing this partly because the data methods are different from the two sides of the analyses. And then I'll end with discussion and some final thoughts. Okay, so motivation, basically historically, men have had more education than women, husbands have had more education than their wives historically. And that has been coupled with norms that in general dictate that men should marry down and women should marry up, not only in education, but in different markers of status, right? That is what we know as the hypergamy norm. You'll hear me say hypergamy many times in this talk. So as we know, there have been different educational expansion processes that have changed the gender composition and the gender distribution of schooling. And that portends important stratification changes, not only between men and women, but also husbands and wives. And we know that the intramarital status difference among couples matter at the union level, right? They informed household bargaining processes, the division of housework, family planning, IPV, a lot of evidence that shows it matters, differences. And at the population level, demographers and stratification scholars, we know that the assortative mating process is really important for inequality between families and across generations. Okay, hopefully you're motivated. I am motivated. We'll go through now theoretical expectations. So, on the one hand, we could expect like gender convergence in spousal preferences, like following more like modernization theories. That, in plain words, means that women's education becomes an attractive trait in the marriage market, as it has been the case for men, right? So it increases the likelihood of marriage because it's connected to economic opportunities, economic empowerment, right? It also yields, it enhances economic independence, and that means that women perhaps have more freedom to choose partners or spouses beyond just thinking about, earnings and so forth. Like it opens that possibility because you have your own economic independence. So, if we follow this thought and some of this evidence, then this would be coupled with, eventually, with an erosion of this like cultural norms about, women have to marry up in status and so forth, right? So this line of thinking led me to two different hypotheses, one for union entry, which is basically that as we see a growth in female schooling across cohorts, we will see that then education becomes positively associated with entering a union, which is the same thing that we observe in the US and Europe and so forth and so on. If we think now in terms of marital pairings or assortative mating, at least we should see a decline in the prevalence of hypergamy in terms of like unions, and similarly in terms of norms, right? And I'll talk how I'm measuring all of this like later. Now, if you know my work, you also know that hypergamy norms in the Latin American context are quite prevalent and sticky, right? And there's a lot of evidence that shows that couples that have deviated from this like hypergamy norm present a lot of problematic outcomes, such as more likelihood of experiencing IPV, reductions of their autonomy, and so forth. So there's something about deviating from this pattern that generates some of this more negative outcomes. And then there's the issue about the Latin American context and Colombia in particular, that although we have observed the very important growth in women's education, female labor participation doesn't behave like that exactly. So the returns of that education is not as high as what we observe in the US or Europe or East Asian context. Female labor participation has increased, but the returns are not as high as here. So there's a weaker relationship between women's education and their labor market outcomes. And that's a conceptual feature that is really important to have in mind in this case. So following that, then, for union entry would have a hypothesis and actually predicts that education is going to be negatively associated with union entry, right? Because women's education is seen as something to avoid in the marriage market. And similarly, in terms of marital pairings, at least we should just observe no change in the tendency of marrying up in terms of hypergamy. So like no major change. There isn't a lot of action going on in terms of proportion of those unions and also in terms of like normative tendencies. So now let's talk more about my empirical case, Colombia. So this is where Colombia is. It's in South America. So part of the case selection is obviously driven by data availability, like often happens. But also, Colombia has a remarkable trend in women's education over time relative to men, right? And Colombian women have had advantages in secondary education and tertiary education since the 1950s onwards. And it's quite sizable in like current cohorts. Different explanations of why this has happened in particular. So there's some evidence showing that the last decade economic crisis really hurt boys in that sort of like substitution effect. They didn't continue schooling, so they went and had jobs. So that could have affected their educational attainment. That happened in the 1990s. And then some compulsory schooling laws that basically really incentivize and increased educational attainment among girls. And this happened in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and at least those three countries. So that really sort of increased women's schooling, especially secondary attainment. So again, I'm presenting the gender gap graph. Now it's flipped. So if you're on top of this line, you are showing a female advantage. As you can see, Colombia has this really interesting trajectory. If you start in the cohorts that were born in the 1920s, there's male advantages, and then we move forward. In 1950s, there's equality in terms of educational attainment, and then we start to see a female advantage moving along over time. So it's a nice case because if you use cohort, you have this like nice variation over time. So as I mentioned, despite increases in schooling, in terms of female labor employment, the outcomes haven't been as what we would observe or expect. There has been growth in employment for sure, but in 2023, the female labor participation rate was 52%. That's like well below what we see here, for example, right? So there's something going on there that is tied to the likelihood that women have of working in the informal sector with worse labor conditions, encounter very significant gender pay gaps as well. All of those things sort of like disincentivizing work. And then on top of that, of course, there's a lot of gender inequality households. So a lot of evidence about the burden of housework is actually like double for women versus men. A lot of care work obviously is on women's shoulders. So you have this like clear double shift going on in Colombia. And this depiction is probably is also relevant for most Latin American countries. And I'm always excluding like Chile, Uruguay, Argentina as a different, but it is relevant for other countries as well. Okay, so let's talk about women's schooling and marriage or union entry. I'll use the word marriage a lot, but I'm always considering cohabitation and marriage. So I use the beloved DHS data here, collected between 2000 and 2016. So the sample here is going to be women born that have 25 to 49 years old. I'm going to focus on two birth cohorts, the 1950 to 1959, that basically kind of contains women that just reach like educational equality, and then they start to gain in terms of education relative to men, but just a little bit. And then I'm going to contrast that with 1970, 1984 birth cohorts where they have a sizable female advantage.
Could you tell us a couple more sentences about cohabitating and how it is in Colombia, how accepted it is, how widespread or?
Yeah, so in general, it's been both like marriage and cohabitation have happened quite frequently historically in Colombia. Like there's not a correlation with education per se, which is why I'm like putting them together. This is not the case, for example, in like more higher income Latin American countries like Chile, Uruguay, where actually cohabitating is related to like lower levels of education. But now that until now, there's like a lot of evidence showing that it's not stigmatized as in other contexts. So which is why I'm like lumping them together. It might be changing now though. As you can see, I'm like looking up to cohorts born in the 1980s for some of this data, so it might be changing. So focusing on two birth cohorts are basically proxies of different stages of female advantages, right? The first one, not a lot, starting the process, and then more. So this yields a sample of around 75,000 cases. So the main outcome that we're going to observe here is age at first union. It's a retrospective measure. And then we're going to use women's educational attainment, categorical, from like some primary to some higher education. We'll use, like I said, birth cohorts in it, like dummy variables, and we'll have some controls where we have region of residence and urban and rural residence. Yeah, I'll say more about that later. So this analysis is basically descriptive. So we're going to use discrete time hazard models. The goal here is to estimate whether and like when this event is occurring. So whether they're entering marriage and when. In a discrete time interval. So I transform my data into person years, and I defined exposure to marriage, so risk of entering a union since age 15. That kind of marks like the quinceañera, like the more like, entry to dating world. So formally, what I'm doing here is just calculating the log odds of entering a union, conditional that you haven't entered a union in the period before, so T-1. And then I'm gonna model that according to exposure. So for exposure, I'm just following prior literature. I'm defining that as a linear spline with knots at ages 19, 24, 28, and 32 plus. So that creates some bins. Then we'll have women's educational attainment, cohorts, a vector of controls, and those clustered standard errors by survey cluster. Okay, so from that basic model, we start to build nested models that like are more and more complex. So we have an interaction between exposure and education. Then we have another one that's education and cohort. Do we see that the curve is like changing according to that interaction, exposure and cohort? And then we have a nice triple interaction between exposure, education, and cohort. I did goodness of fit statistics, and model 5 was the preferred model for my data. And as you can imagine, those coefficients are not easy to interpret, so I did predicted probabilities at representative values. So that's what I'm going to show you. Now, before I go into the discrete time models, I just wanted to show a nice Kaplan-Meier survival curves for the two birth cohorts. So again, the cohorts are used to represent different stages of educational expansion. I'm sorry, it's a bit small. Remember that the older cohorts of women have just started to have a small female advantage. So you'll see here, we have age. This is proportion single, right? And each line represents an educational attainment level. So from blue, that's some primary, to red, some secondary, green is secondary, and yellow is some higher education. So some things to note here. So basically, among older cohorts, less educated women are marrying sooner than the more educated counterparts. We see that, right? They fall into a union sooner, but this gap starts to shrink around 25, you start to see that the more educated women start to enter unions. And there's still a gap, but as you'll see among the younger cohorts, the gap among younger cohorts is larger, and you see there's even more differentiation in terms of the timing of entering marriage, in terms of the highly educated women. So just, I thought like visually, it's like easier to see what's happening here. So basically, we have some associational evidence that as gender gaps in schooling are reduced, we start to see that highly educated women are married later and less. And we see that this gap in entry to marriage seems to increase over time. So these results are quite similar if we look into the discrete model. So these are predicted probabilities estimated from my preferred model, that model 5 with a lot of interactions. So the x-axis again contains age of exposure. They're like in bins, right? So 15 to 19, 20 to 23, and so forth. This is 32 and plus. We have log odds, probability of entering a union. So I'll walk you through this. So as expected from the Kaplan-Meier, we see a negative association between women's schooling and entering a union, especially in this like earlier ages of exposure. There's a clear decline in both cohorts. What is interesting is that if you look at older ages, so 32 plus or 22 and 31, more educated women used to like catch up much more at those ages than they're doing in the younger cohorts. And, you know, to some extent, the less educated are also not catching up here, but they were doing here, right? So that is kind of explaining why we see this difference in union entry. And I think this is even clearer in this graph. This is just plotting predicted probabilities among women with higher education, of some higher education. So the dark yellow is older cohorts, and the lighter yellow is younger cohorts, so more female advantages. As you can see, virtually almost every exposure, we see that the younger cohorts are and have lower odds of entering a union, right? So putting all together, what we're learning here is that we're seeing that highly educated women are increasingly less likely to enter a union, either a marriage or a cohabitation. And this is something that we see over cohorts, right? And this is a pattern we have observed in other high gender inequality contexts like Japan or South Korea, although that seems to be just changing now, but it did for a long time. These results are robust to the inclusion also of a third birth cohort in the middle, in case you were concerned that, you know, these are special cohorts. And this is consistent with my prior work where I use a causal framework using instrumental variables, in which I also find that women's education actually decreases. There's a causal effect in decreasing the likelihood of entering a union. Women that, you know, increase their schooling due to expansion reforms. So it's kind of nice that we find the same result. And I find this in Colombia and also in Peru and Bolivia, actually. So you may be thinking this might be due to two completely different things. On the one hand, it may be that women are just choosing to reject marriage or partnerships. Maybe it's not really a good deal. There's a lot of high gender inequality. Maybe they're better on their own. Now they have better jobs, some of them. And so basically, maybe it's a matter of choice. But we also know that a quite different mechanism is what's known as a marriage market mismatch. Basically, they're looking for someone that's at least equally educated or more educated. There are not enough of those men in this market, and therefore they're not entering union, at least in the age I observe. I cannot, in this work, say which is the more important mechanism, but I think I can say for now, putting all the evidence together, that we're not, at least at this stage, have any evidence of gender convergence in terms of education. So we're not seeing that women's education is more likely, to put you in a marriage or union, as we have observed in other cases. Okay. So what happens among the women that are entering unions or marriage? So for this, I'm going to use census data provided by IPUMS. I use the Colombia census starting in the 1940s until the most recent data collection. And so we're focusing on prevailing marriages and cohabitating couples. These partners are between 25 to 60 years old. I capped it at 25 so that they have finished most of their educational transitions. And then this yields a very large sample, as you can see in the screen. Again, the most important variable here is spouse's educational attainment. This again is a categorical measure. And then I classify unions according to their levels of education, right? So if spouses have the same level of schooling following these categorical variables, they're going to be classified as following homogamy. If the husband has more education relative to the wife, we're going to classify that as hypergamy. And if the wife is more educated than the husband, we're going to say that that's hypogamy. So homogamy, hypogamy. You'll hear me a lot say those words. Yes.
And this is irrespective of their ages.
Yes.
Because maybe the husbands have more education because they're older.
Yeah, really good point. I did a robustness check on that. So the age gap between spouses in the Colombian context throughout these cohorts is around 5 years old. And it's not changing a lot over time, but it's a good question. I was concerned too. Okay, and then of course we're going to use again wife's birth cohort as a proxy of the stage of educational expansion. And so here we have more cohorts to work with. We're going to start with 1920s, which is where there was actually a male advantage, right? And then up to the 1980s, where there's a consolidated female advantage. And the female advantage, I have to say, is present both in secondary attainment and higher education in the Colombian case. Okay, so changes in women's schooling can shift marital patterns via two distinct processes, right? One is by changing the availability or scarcity of specific educational credentials in a marriage market, right? So you can imagine a country where there's little expansion, most people have less than elementary education, we'll find a lot of homogamy in that market. And that's like a product of composition, right? It's like a mechanical product of composition. Another mechanism is when this generates changes in what we called social conventions in this literature, right? So the norms and preferences that guide marital matches or union matches. Those norms would say what matches are acceptable or desirable or that we reject. I talked a lot about the hypergamy norm as an example of a convention.
First one, is this refer to a specific age interval?
Yeah.
Specific age gap between
So
potential partners?
in this case, I just have this age bracket that I defined at the get-go. And what I did was just to do a robustness check to see if is age playing a role in this. And it's not, just because age gaps are not very big in the Colombian context. So it's an average of 5 years and it remains quite constant over time. But you could do like a different study on, age assortative mating and what happens with the composition in a context where there's a lot of age differences, right, between couples. So two different approaches. The first one is quite simple. I'm just gonna plot over time changes in this union pairings over time to see what do we observe, just who's marrying who according to application. Do we find anything changing over time? And for the second mechanism, I'm going to use log linear models for contingency tables, which has been kind of the typical way to approach this question of social conventions. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, so whether it completely captures what we call social conventions, but it's a proxy of that, a proxy of what's left when we keep composition constant. Yes.
Good question on, I forgot what ages are included in,
Yes.
so like full population, because I was thinking about you're capturing mostly like surviving unions, and you mentioned in the past that, hypergamy that's related to probability of separation. So I was wondering how you think about that.
Fair point. I did a robustness check, so I limited, like I did 25.
Like younger,
because you could have differential mortality by education, right? So yeah, valid concern, I did that. But nothing changes like significantly. Let's talk about log linear models. So log linear models describe basically the association between husbands and wives' education over time as we control for all the marginal changes in educational composition. So it's an exercise of trying to get changes in composition controlled and see if there's what else is happening once we get rid of that compositional variation. So we do this by generating three-way tables. We cross-classify women's education, the husband's education, and the cohort. So you get a very intense table. And then we're trying to model those patterns in a more parsimonious way, right? We're trying to capture the pattern in the contingency table by more parsimonious specifications, right? And so one starting point that I did here is that I use the homogamy model, which assumes that the mating patterns are captured by the marginal distribution of husband's education, wife's education, and cohort, their interactions. And then we have a final term, this gamma, that is just measuring the homogamy across the diagonal of the table. So you start from this very fairly simple model and make things a bit more complex, model the diagonal, model the minor diagonals, and then do goodness of fit statistics and choose your best model. I have some prior methodological work sort of criticizing this way of doing things, but I think that is problematic when you have sparse cells, which is not the case with this data. I have a lot of data, I don't have sparse cells. It would have been nice to apply my own approach, but it didn't make a lot of sense in this case. So let's talk about main results. So let's start with a very descriptive part. So who is marrying who? This is like we're taking composition into account. So this is a graph that contains the different unions across widespread cohorts. So the green line is homogamy, the blue line is hypogamy, so marrying down, women marrying down, and then we have hypergamy, women marrying up. So interesting things happening here. As I found in my prior work, we have important declines in homogamy over time. We have some very nice increase in hypogamy, so women marrying up over time. And then hypergamy mostly stays quite flat over time. The flatness that I found in Colombia is actually something that I find in my work with Maggie Fry and Sarah Lopez in this PDR article, where we basically find flat or actually increasing trends with educational expansion in the Latin American case. And that's partly a product of why how people measure union marital pairings. Let's zoom into hypogamous unions. So these are marriages where women are more educated. So basically we're seeing that this increase in hypogamous unions are basically driven by women that have secondary education and to some extent tertiary education. Though that is like, those women are like really thriving, increasing hypogamy. This evidence, these trends that I'm using wife's birth cohort, but they look quite similar if we use a period perspective. It's not like completely changed if we look at things by period. So that was composition, right? So now let's take a look at marital conventions. These are all of the linear models I tested. So you start from the independence, conditional independence, and you make things more and more complex. The preferred model was a more complex one. Number 10, it contains a diagonal term that captures homogamy at different educational levels. And then it has an asymmetric term that models separately hypergamy from hypogamy in the minor diagonals. So if you're done linear models, the results are really difficult to understand in a table form. So I usually present just predicted probabilities using the log odds. So here we have basically the log odds for each combination of partners' educational level relative to a baseline category, which is 1920. So let's pause here. So each panel represents wife's education. So less than primary, secondary, and tertiary, that's the wife. That's the birth cohort, wife birth cohort. And then the lines represent the husband's schooling. So take this line, this blue line is basically the log odds of a woman with less than primary marrying a man with less than primary. So homogamy at the bottom. And then, of course, this is the trend over time. So everything that you see flat basically means there haven't been changes in conventions once we control for change in composition. Okay, so a few things to note. There's a lot of things, so I'll go slowly. The thing that captures your eye first is a decline in homogamy at the bottom and a quite important increase of homogamy at the top. So this is a pattern that we have found also, for example, in the US. It's quite important if we think in terms of like inequality and stratification, because it means there's a lot of homogamy amongst the more educated. And it also implies and it convention, highly educated women have a lot of pressure to marry at least equally educated men. Then the other surprising and interesting finding is that among women that have secondary education, they're still more likely to marry up. So they're still more likely to marry a man with tertiary schooling. So this is like the hypergamy convention, and it kind of hasn't changed significantly over time. Then we have two other things, very interesting things going on in terms of hypogamy conventions. We see slight increases, but interesting increases in marrying down among women with tertiary schooling. So some of them are marrying down and they partnered with a man with secondary education, and we see slight increases in those log odds from the 1970s onwards. And same with women with secondary, although it's not the most likely outcome, some of them are starting to marry down men with primary education. And lastly, it's always interesting to see that at the lower levels of education, it seems that there's always been more fluidity in terms of gender, in terms of assorted mating. So women with primary education have always been quite likely to marry down, like they marry men with less than primary. That has a tendency that has kept over time. So it kind of signifies that all these barriers that we talked about, hypergamy norms and markers of status, is really thinking about like the top, or at least secondary and tertiary parts of the distribution of education. So I've presented a lot of evidence. I'm going to do a summary. So we see two significant changes over time as women's education grows over birth cohorts. On the one hand, we see increase in the prevalence of hypogamy, right? So after homogamy, hypogamy is the most typical pairing in Colombia, just by looking at the composition of the marriage market. And there's some incipient, evidence that indicates that conventions, so like the norms, are also looking like there's an increase in hypogamy, perhaps some evidence that this, norms about female advantage are starting to change in the Colombian context, especially at the cohorts that have a lot of female advantage. The other interesting thing is, of course, the growth of homogamy at the top of the distribution, as I mentioned before, among tertiary education women. Again, as I mentioned, this has been found in other contexts, and it's quite important for inequality across families. Then lastly, as I mentioned before, we don't see like considerable declines in hypergamy, so marrying up in education. And in terms of conventions, we see that among women with secondary schooling, it's still more likely, like convention, you would marry up. So there's still, hypergamy is still part of the picture, it's still quite relevant, and at least I wouldn't say there's an end to hypergamy in the Colombian context. Someone was asking me about this. The findings are robust to like a smaller window in terms of ages. Partners with 25 to 34. I did this mostly because of mortality, lack of mortality concerns. So that's the evidence I'll discuss. So how increases in women's schooling have changed or not union information processes if we look at the case of Colombia, right? So, on the one hand, I showed that as this process unfolds, actually there's a negative association between schooling and entering a union that is intensified and grows over time. So women are, highly educated women, less likely to get married, and this increases over time. And I present an associational evidence, but in my prior work, I actually presented more causal evidence of this. This is important because it's a finding that is in sharp contrast with what we see in the US and European context, where we've seen over time that education predicts marriage entry. And again, I want to talk about the important contextual feature that we have here, right? So there's been growth in women's education that's not quite connected to economic empowerment. And that is kind of a very important assumption in theories about change in marriage. There's an economic foundation that is underlying that theory. So in this case, perhaps we don't have sufficient change to shape the foundations of marriage, at least marriage entry or union entry. Now, if we look at assorted mating or marital patterns, we do find evidence of interesting change towards more gender symmetry, if you will. We find that there's an increase in unions of women marrying down in education in Colombia as this cohorts get more educated. There's some evidence that conventions have started to change. Now, it is small, but I think there's something there that is like indicating the erosion of some of those conventions, especially among highly educated women. And contrary to my expectations when I started this work, a lot of stability when we think about hypergamy. So hypergamy is quite an important pairing for some women, and especially secondary women, and that continues to be the case. Lastly, I mentioned this before, there's an increased pressure for highly educated women to marry at least their equal, so highly educated men in the Colombian context. So let's put these findings together. Like, what are we learning from looking at union entry and marriage patterns in the Colombian case? So I interpret taking the findings, I interpret them as different behavioral responses among highly educated women that are facing a marriage market where there are female advantages in the marriage market. So for some women, because there's a limited pool of highly educated men, some of them are starting to marry down. And so that is found by the increase in hypogamy in my data. They're defining to some extent at least status avoidance of women. And then another response is basically just postponing or just exiting the union, the marriage market pool. And so that could be happening in different ways. On the one hand, we have a lot of pressure to marry equally educated men among highly educated women. So perhaps we're seeing some sort of marriage market mismatch, and that's why we're seeing lower levels of union entry among the highly educated. But as I said before, it could also be just a rejection of marriage and unions in a context where at least heterosexual couples have a lot of gender inequality, right, embedded in couples. I cannot say with the evidence I presented what is the predominant outcome or mechanism regarding these two, but I'm starting work with my collaborators, Maggie, Fry, and Sarah Lupus, where we try to look at a broader set of countries and use contextual features to try to get an answer at this part of the puzzle. Caveats, always are some caveats. I'm only looking into women's union entry, right? I don't have data for men. This is like the problem across all my work. I don't have the men. The data doesn't exist. I should do something about it. We'll see. But at least for union entry, there's no men. And of course, that's a very important part of the story. And the second caveat is a more substantive. I'm looking at educational assortative mating, right? And I'm seeing some evidence of increases in hypogamy, less female status avoid, perhaps among the highly educated. But we know that sometimes there's evidence from the European Union and India and so forth. This hypogamy unions in terms of education many times sort of compensate by women having lower incomes or coming from lower status families. So it's a more multidimensional process. Obviously, I'm just looking at one dimension here. Just to finish, I'll say briefly some broader implications. So I think the studying the Colombian case is quite interesting because we basically see divergent results or trends according to the dimension of union formation that we're studying, right? So growth in female schooling generates quite different things in terms of union entry versus marital patterns than what we've seen before. And it suggests that this might happen in other Latin American countries, sharing some of these contextual features. Most Latin American countries have high gender inequality in households, and a lot of female labor employment is not as high as it should be according to educational attainment that we have. And lastly, I think this sort of underscores the relevance of testing our hypotheses and theories in settings with different contextual conditions. That kind of drives a lot of my work. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Daniela, questions, comments?
No questions about? No? Yes, please.
In an ideal world where people are independently wealthy, I can see how education would make a difference. If people have solved their problems of, living. But I don't understand how you can isolate education from their jobs and their, the money they earn. And I don't know if it's that women, like you say, there is this pressure to marry a man with a university degree, but this cannot be in isolation of their, productivity and the money they will earn with that degree. So I don't see how it's the degree per se, or, how do you deal with their jobs and the money they earn?
This is a great question. This is something that I should start to look into. As you see, it's quite complex to look at marriage markets. And this is why I usually start by education, because it has this potential connection to labor market, but it's also connected to a lot of values about gender equality and so forth. Connecting the two would be ideal, right? And something that definitely is in my mind. But for now, there's a lot of I would say methodological constraints and data constraints as well. And we have a scenario where female employment in a lot of these countries, a lot of it is in informal areas. That's also really hard to measure in this setting. But yeah, definitely that's a next step. I agree. Any more questions? Pilar.
Muchas preguntas. But I'm gonna ask you just a few, just a couple of very quick ones. One was just connecting the two. So can you do anything in your log linear model to address the changing selectivity to marriage? Because that's also a part of what's happening here. You have, as you showed in your analysis. That was one thing. The other thing that I was curious very quickly, if you could tell us something about, there seem to be changes in marriage patterns among educational groups that are not the ones that are most impacted by the expansions, like those with less than primary or the primary. Like some increasing in lower age marriage, for instance, and what's going on in other places, right? Like if expanding education, we're thinking that it would impact more like those higher educated groups, but we're also seeing some changes in that period of time among the lower educated groups. So how do we sort of use that information to help us assess, what you see at the top? And last, real quickly, and underlying, so you've been setting up a little bit this contrast between lower income countries and higher income countries in terms of what we saw in higher income countries, we're not seeing it here as much. And I was wondering how much of that is about a stage. You haven't mentioned the gender revolution framework or the second demographic framework, but some of the gender revolution specifically would expect that the earlier stages of increasing gender equality in some dimensions, you would have more reticence to change the roles, and then some of this stuff might not be taken, but then it starts to change. Earlier data in the US did show that women's education was negatively associated with the likelihood to marry earlier on, and it only changed after. So what is your commentary on what do you see after?
Yeah, so I'll start with the gender revolution question. I mean, it might be the case that we're just this earlier stage, right? So in that article, it's at first, women's employment becomes an adversary to your information, and then it becomes, as we change our values and women are in the labor market force, then it actually becomes an enabler, right, of family formation. And it may be absolutely the case that we're just starting to look at the beginning of that gender revolution in Colombia. I hope it's happening. Your question about linear and selectivity. This is an issue. I thought about applying my IB compulsory schooling to see marital pairings. That could be an option. It's definitely something to improve. Do you have any? Are you thinking about
No, I mean, I was more thinking about how would you expect that to change? So we see this increased homogamy among the higher educated women. And a lot of that is also coming from, so fewer of them are marrying over time. In that group. So just some of it might just be qualifying the findings. I don't know, method-wise, I don't have the specific suggestion.
In the prior article where I used this IB framework with compulsory schooling, I find reductions in autonomy among highly educated women. And I argue in the paper by looking at the compliers, this is partly happening because these women are marrying down. And so it's kind of a compensation. It's not a direct causal mechanism, but I'm suggesting that's kind of what is happening among, this is early adopters of educational hypogamy in Colombia. So that's a way in which I approach it, but it would be nice to do something even like more robust, like using the cohorts over time. I think this paper has a lot going on, so this is why I kept it like quite descriptive, because I was truly interested in looking at the two dimensions. But yeah, like this selection piece is.
Yeah, I guess there could be like, there could be a cell too, in both of them, like unmarried,
Mhm.
men and women,
Yeah.
and we could like model that.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is what I'm like trying to do in my collaboration with Maggie and Sarah, and trying to look at more cross-country variation to get a sense of that, like who's not getting married, like, like explore that group and then how that fits into the marriage market. So we will see.
Yeah, well, so thanks very much for the talk. So my question is about your slides. You talked about the changing social conventions versus the changing availability. So you refer to Schoen's work. He defined this attractiveness score. But well, that means, well, we can measure, say, men's preferences and women's preferences, but eventually those are all hidden, and we only see the realized the results. So my question is whether it's driven by our men's, they don't want to marry highly educated women, which is really the case in China. There is increasing stigma associated, particularly with female PhDs. People view them as not feminine, are overeducated, so not conform to traditional gender roles, or it's driven by changing preferences of women. So they don't really want to marry men who have less education than them.
Yeah.
So, so to the point that for these different countries, you suggested that we see similar trends. So women delay their entry into marriage, but the interpretations may be different.
Yeah, absolutely in point. This is something that I'm planning to do. I look at I think it's called like dual marriage model, right? Where you're trying to model the availability of women and men in a marriage market and try to get some level of like preferences and level of attractiveness. I think it's like a 1980s paper, the Schoen model. And so that's something that is in my mind. Evidence about China. I mean, you're absolutely in point. Like this could be, on the one hand, this mismatch situation in which women are just not finding this equally educated men, or or men are actively rejecting them, or themselves don't want to get married anymore. They're like the empirical evidence could have quite different mechanisms at play. And this is something that has like motivated me and bothered me for a long time when I was using longitudinal work. So I have other experimental work using a conjoint experiment where I'm trying to get at this mechanism of like, what is female status avoidance? Is it actually education? Is it more earnings? So I can talk more about this maybe when we meet, but I present different couples with different dimensions and I do a conjoint and I'm trying to extract kind of like what people think are the best matches that's in the American context. But yeah, this is something that I want to answer, and I'm not answering directly with this work, right? So yeah, and I need the China paper email you for the PhD one. Thank you. Thank you.
Very interesting. I want to ask you, when you look at other demographic dimensions in Latin America, you see huge polarization. Like for instance, with fertility, you have fertility decline on one side, but then you have increases in teenage childbearing.
Yeah.
So what you see like two different worlds. Something like that. Is there something like that going on here that you have, like a highly educated, modern who's actually not marrying, and then you have continuity among everybody else? Or is there? I mean, I couldn't quite see it here, but is there like a polarization here into different worlds?
Yeah, well, to some extent, we do see that in the assertive mating part, right? We see that there's a lot of increases in homogamy amongst the very educated, and then there's actually been fluidity, like in terms of marital barriers. That's been happening for a while along the lower educated. I am interested in the fertility side of this question because we've seen very stark declines in fertility in Colombia and like many of the countries I cite in my work. but this polarization framework, I think, could be applicable to some of my findings, especially the marital, the sort of mating part, right? The entry into a union is very much a product of highly educated women somehow not marrying at the extent they used to in the past. I think that's like more connected to this, or like hypergamy norms and the value, the social value attached to a woman's education in a specific cultural context. But when we look at the marriage market and the sort of mating patterns, I think there's definitely something more going on with polarization, which is why it's so important to look at what's going on with homogamy pattern among the very educated. And I think when Flores Torcha has like done a lot of that type of work at the top. But yeah, I think it could be it's a good way to talk about it too. Alicia.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for your presentation. Very interesting work. So my question is, so you combined cohabitation and marriage, right?
Yes.
And we know that the pattern of informal unions in Latin America, as you know, has always been different from that of, the conceptualization of informal unions, right? Like the idea of consensual unions and all of that. So two questions. One, I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about your rationale for combining in light of the idea of consensual unions, but also whether you tried the models, whether you tried just marriage, just formal marriage and cohabitation, and if you found different patterns.
Yes. Short answer, yes. But so your consensual unions, are you talking specifically about the change in law that allows you like a consensual?
Oh, right. I mean, the idea that, the meaning of informal unions in Latin America has been different from the patterns and meanings, right?
Yes.
Or something of like the highly educated, it started out differently.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's something about, if you're capturing some of that here, like.
Yeah. In the big scheme of things, no, the things look quite similar, but I only have 1980 cohorts. So there's some evidence. I met someone when I was giving this talk elsewhere that was saying that in the youngest cohort, we're seeing like a huge shift, against like outside marriage, like everyone moving into cohabitation, like massively. So Chile is a case, and now there's a lot of children born out of wedlock in Chile. So that I think I don't have an answer for that because that's like more like recent cohorts, but it is something to look into. I'm not sure if like meaning is changing in terms of cohabitation or it's actually just about marriage, right? People like moving away from the institution of marriage. And in a lot of countries now, there's like a legal way in which you get a consensual union. So you're basically not married, but you have access to all the legal protections.
There's that too. Yeah, that component as well, that muds
everything. And we also have really important increases in divorce in a lot of Latin American countries, something that I would love to study more. But the data for that is tricky, but I like a challenge. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. I think we run out of time. Thank you, Daniela.
Hey, I owe you a paper and it's already late.
Just.
So I saw the other day.
Fired. Yes. Mine has been, how has it been like registering lunch? Yeah.
So you haven't got like.
Otherwise you would not. Not move to
Fine. Here today and I found.
What's the point of saying?
Half an hour.
你是感冒了吗？我咳嗽就会咳很久，我就有点。